The novel, rooted in the lore of medieval France, unfolds a tale of Jiazhu Thuyun, forbidden love, and the haunting echoes of moral decay. Set against the backdrop of two long feuding castles, Pitaval and Pont, the narrative intertwines historical mystique with psychological intensity. Aymar Galliez, our narrator, introduces the story mirroring Pitaval's script, weaving a tale that initially seems disconnected, but gradually reveals its profound linkages. The vanished river Le Pit symbolically mirrors the hidden currents of hatred and passion that run deep beneath the surface of these families' histories. The plot thickens with the introduction of Bertrand, a child whose very existence embodies the fears and superstitions of the time. An omen of dread, manifested in his unusual physical trait, hair on his palms, foreshadows a destiny intertwined with darkness. As Bertrand matures, his character becomes a focal point of controversy and speculation, reflecting the villagers' belief in his potentially demonic nature. Josephine's tragic love affair with Aymar further complicates the narrative, entangling them in a web of deceit and desire. Pregnant and desperate, Josephine's obsession with Aymar consumes her, while Aymar, plagued by guilt and fear, retreats into melancholy. The impending birth of their child exacerbates tensions, leading to Josephine's confinement due to her suicidal threats. Intertwined with these personal tragedies are supernatural elements and folklore, with tales of monsters lurking in forests and mysterious strangers visiting the village fair, hinting at a world where the line between reality and myth is blurred. These elements serve as metaphors for the hidden truths and secrets that shape the characters' destinies. Aymar's aunt, Madame Didier, represents stability amidst chaos, yet her sudden demise and her will, which mandates Aymar to care for those affected by his actions and pursue a religious path, adds a layer of moral reckoning to the tale. This bequest forces Aymar to confront the consequences of his passions and the legacy he must uphold. Wolf's Mark is a story of human frailty, the consequences of desire, and the inescapable ties to one's lineage. It explores themes of fate, redemption, and the intricate dance between love and destruction, all set against the rich tapestry of 19th-century France. Through its intricate plotting and deeply flawed characters, the novel paints a haunting portrait of humanity's struggle with its own primal instincts and the quest for absolution. Chapter 1. It is only inasmuch as Aymar Galliez begins his script with the tale of Pitaval and Pont that I shall do the same, allowing myself, however, the privilege of elaborating his often too bald treatment. The incident herein noted would seem at first glance to have nothing to do with the case. Neither does digging a well below a house seem to have anything to do with the typhoid that carries away one victim after another. The sources of moral diseases too often lie far back in the past. Pitaval and Pont, then, are two castles in France which lie on opposite sides of a little streamlet called Le Pit. I am aware, of course, that the Joan Gazetteer contains no mention of a pit of any kind. The fact is that the two castles, of which hardly a vestige remains, now look at each other across a dry valley. When lumbering removed the topsoil of these hills, the river dried up, but its course can still be traced by a trail of rocks winding upwards. Local archaeologists, if there are any in that mountainous and infertile region 25 miles west and south of Grenoble, will resolve the disappearance of these place names. If the traveler today can see little if anything in this region, one visitor certainly saw plenty. I refer to Violet Leduc, who went into ecstasy at this spot and drew complete plans and an imaginary reconstruction. This, if I am not mistaken, the reader may find under the discussion of Barbette. There is a reference too under the subject of latrine. It will be recalled that Violet Leduc was always keen on any vestiges of medieval sanitary engineering. Possibly there was more to see in his day. As far back as history can recall, the castles of Pitaval and Pont, though the families were offshoots of one original house, were at constant war with each other. In the early days, the two houses had divided between them on extensive and fertile territory. The hillsides yielded a superior wine. The forest fattened pigs, produced charcoal and chestnuts. The peasantry was hardy and cheerful and paid its taxes to lord and priest generously and usually peacefully. But the constant warfare between the two houses eventually proved too much for the local peasantry, though surely there is nothing in history to equal the permanent patience of the sorely tried poor. They abandoned their farms and moved on. There was still free land in Europe at that time, so why stay where life was insecure? As the estates began to yield less and less, the Pitavals and the Pittamonts, pressed for money to carry on their feud, began to make trips down the hill to the city of Grenoble where there was a Datini factor, or even to Avignon, where the great banking firm of the Datinis had its head office. Bit by bit, they mortgaged what they had. The interest piled up. Once in a while the Pitavals would rob the Pitamonts and pay up some of what they owed to Datini. Again it was the turn of the Pitamonts to stage a clever coup and find themselves momentarily in cash. One night a begging friar, benighted in these mountains, found hospitality in the Pitaval castle. The women, miserably treated among their brutal menfolk, were glad for the appearance of a strange and kindly face. The venerable monk entertained the ladies with tales of the land of Italy, whence he had just come. "It is all sunshine and warmth down there," he said, and played meditatively with his long beard. The ladies shivered with yearning. Outside the wind howled. The draught came in under the door and disturbed the rushes on the floor. A dog, or was it a wolf, howled beyond in the forest. They crossed themselves. The monk added a few words of Latin. One young giant of a Pitaval slapped the table with his chunky hand and laughed hoarsely. "I hear that the men there, and elsewhere too, for the fashion has spread, write poetry, which they sing to the ladies while they twang on a lute. Is that so? Do men do that?" The monk added, "It is a pretty and gentle custom. Our Lord too loved peace." The ladies looked wistfully at the friar. He seemed to have some of that southern sun and some of that gentle poetry of love clinging to him. But the men, red from much wine, had already turned away from the monk and were discussing their next boar hunt. The fire in the chimney had died down. The smoking candles had burned low. The men and women retired. The monk was permitted to stretch himself out on the floor, with a few sheepskins to protect himself from the cold. The silence in the castle was extreme, the darkness complete. The monk threw off his sheepskins and rose slowly. From the folds of his cowl he drew a long, sharp dagger. He, a Pitamont disguised by a beard grown in secret, was free. In the Pitaval castle at night, his breath came and went softly through his parted teeth. He had marked where the men and women had gone to retire and now directed his steps slowly toward the chambers of the sleeping Pitavals. He reached the first room. Faint light, from clouds lit by the moon behind them, shone through the narrow window. He dropped to his hands and knees and crept up to the bed. The curtains were parted. Holding his dagger with both hands he drew it aloft and brought it down full force on the man who lay sleeping there. A slush was the only sound, like that which a foul apple gives when you step on it. "What is it, Robert?" the lady beside him whispered sleepily. Already the Pitamont had freed his dagger and brought it down again. Silence. Pitamont stole softly out of that room of death and on to the next. Not a Pitaval was to be left alive in that castle by the morning. This was to be the end of them. But as he groped his way along the wall, his foot caught in a crevice and he went down on his face. His dagger was torn from his hands and went clattering down a short flight of steps. "Hola, Hughes! Hola, Jouffroy! Light!" "'Tis only I," said the monk. The young giant Pitaval, naked, had come up and collared him. "And what are you doing up here?" "I was only looking for a place to relieve myself," the friar explained. "The ashes of the hearth are not good enough for you?" By this time everybody in the castle was awake, everybody but the two who slept forever. In the morning, the new master of the castle of Pitaval was the young giant, heir to his father's estate. Pitamont, the false monk, was locked in a little cell, where he pondered on the curious mischance that had ruined his plans so near success. "I am not afraid to die," he said to himself with a sneer on his lips. In the great central hall, the young giant sat with his pretty wife and thought. "Now what shall we do with your sunny Italian?" He laughed. She turned away and wept. He summoned the stone mason from the nearest village. The two sat together for several hours and then the mason called for his assistance and went to work. In an interior court of the castle stood an old well that was not often used, a larger and better one having been dug at a more convenient point. The old well was now enlarged down to near water level, a fairly permanent level, and their heavy iron bars were laid across the waterhole. A cesspool was constructed close to the well, with two pipes, one opening at the water level shelf in the well, the other for ventilation leading up to the surface of the earth. 15 or 20 feet above the shelf, a dome was constructed. Before it was completely done, the false monk, half asphyxiated with smoke, was lowered onto the shelf. Then the dome was finished all but for a small central orifice which remained for ventilation. The whole affair had been lined with smooth hard stone cut to fit without a crevice. Above the earth was a small superstructure, likewise of stone, and barred by a heavy iron door. Within, a flight of steps led down to the ventilating chamber directly above the dome. 3 times a week a servant, accompanied by the master, went into the chamber and threw a heavy chunk of meat and suet into the aperture. Fell with a thud onto the iron bars over the waterhole. For months there was no answering sound. When Jehan Pitamont awoke from the effects of the smoke, he found himself in a dark cold chamber. He was naked and shivered. His first thought was that he was dead, and that this was the afterlife which the priests promised. But he had soon undeceived himself. As he groped around, he discovered that his new abode was a small circular cell. Standing in the middle on an iron grating, with outstretched arms, his hands easily touched both sides. There was only one break in the circular continuity of the wall that lined the cell, and that was a slight recess. In the floor of this niche in the wall was a circular hole about half a span in width. Jehan guessed at once what this was for. The only furniture of the room, if furniture it could be called, was a small iron dipper attached by a short iron chain to the grating. With this one could reach down and secure a drink of water. Cold sweat stood out on Jehan's body when he had fully realized the nature of the dwelling place to which he had been transferred. He was in an oubliette, forgetress so to speak. He had heard of them but had never seen one. Now he himself was in one. But he did not despair. He even had moments when he laughed to think how he had deceived these stupid Pitavals, and how he had killed the old Pitaval himself and his wife in their sodden sleep. He would soon be out of this place. His brothers and his father would never leave him here. Any moment now he expected to hear the ring of an axe against the walls of his prison. His side had slaughtered all the Pitavals and were coming to free him. But nothing happened. There was not a sound. And still he waited expectantly. They would come. First, of course, they had to prepare themselves. They would come in force, storm the castle walls and kill the damned Pitavals, man and mouse, every single one of them. Then they would search for him. And they would find him, no matter how well he had been hidden. But surely by this time, he said to himself, a horrible doubt arising in his mind, they would have already been here had they come at all. Perhaps they had been repulsed at the storming, and had withdrawn to gather more men. Surely they were not going to leave him to rot here. No, but he must give them time. How long had he been here? Who can tell time? In the darkness? He had remained 2 days in the room where they had kept him, locked up at first. Then they had made him dizzy with smoke and had brought him here. Now, how long was it since they had put him in here? Seemed like days, but it could be only hours, for they had not yet given him any food, and he had not slept once. No doubt they would throw food to him once a day, and he would feel sleepy once a day so that he could count time that way. He determined to keep track of his imprisonment. Time passed. He dozed and woke, dozed off again and woke once more. He was famished. Would they never feed him? Had they put him here to starve? Good. Then he would starve. Better so. He was not afraid to die. Time passed. He was weak from lack of food. He heard sounds above him. A jingle of keys. Someone was in the chamber above him. He heard faint whispered voices. He was about to shout out, Poton, thinking it must be his brother. Then he bethought himself. He would wait and see how his jailers would laugh at him if he made that mistake. He waited. It was not Poton. It was young Pitaval. Here's food for you, my solitary monk. Do you want a prayer stool? Or a lute to twang on? Jehan made no answer. ACH. If I could lay my hands on your fat neck, he thought. The sharp fragrance of roasted fowl came to his nostrils. Something fell from above and landed on the grating over the waterhole. The footsteps passed on. A door banged shut. His hands went to seize the roast. No, he would not touch a bite of it. He would starve himself to death. He was thirsty too. His throat ached. He would have a drink of water that could not harm, and would serve to help him resist the pangs of hunger. He found the dipper in the dark and slipped it through the grating. The water was cool and sweet. That meat was tempting. That roasted crust of fat fowl, how often he had bitten through it. Why, only the other night as a monk at table with the Pitavals, but he had forborne helping himself too liberally. As a monk it behooved him to be frugal. He regretted that he had not eaten more of it. What could it have harmed had he eaten a larger portion? The table had been loaded down with food when they had risen to go to bed. There was fowl and venison, and a dish of chopped greens and cold prawns in a sauce of vinegar. Good. That. His mouth watered. In the 2 days that he had been locked in the other cell they had fed him nothing but bread, dry bread. Why was he thinking so much of food? Food was a matter of the past for him. He meant to die. He was through with food. But this was agony with that roasted fowl filling the cell with its odor. He would kill himself and end this torture. If only he could lift up that grating and drown himself in the water. But the grating was fastened too securely. If he could hitch himself up the wall and cast himself down. But while he could reach the opposite walls, they were tantalizingly beyond the reach of a good muscular purchase. Had they measured him to make sure of adding that extra torture to this prison? He beat his head against the wall. He made it bloody by hammering against the grating. He fainted. But when he came to, the first thing that struck him was the odor of roasted meat. Damn that meat. He would get rid of it. He would throw it down into the cesspool. Yes, that was it. Down the cesspool and away. With all thoughts of food out of reach, out of mind. The fowl was a large one. A goose, no doubt. It would not go into the opening. He tore it into pieces, dismembered it, and put the separate pieces down. He heard them fall far below. The great bulk of the fowl, however, stuck in the pipe. He had to push it down. He pushed it down as far as he could, and there it remained stuck fast. There, that was that. Good God! What had he done? He had cast away his only food. He was about to cry out in despair. No, he must not make any sound. That would be shameful. They were waiting somewhere for him to cry out, that they might laugh at him and taunt him. No, never a sound must come from his lips. He stilled the cries in his throat, pushed his hands into his mouth to deaden any sound that might strive to issue from his agonized body. He found himself licking his hands, greedily licking his fingers, smacking his lips, searching with his tongue between his fingers to find yet another bit of grease remaining from the fowl he had thrown away. Perhaps he could still reach that big piece that he had had so much difficulty pushing down into the drain. He put his arm down. He could just feel the fowl below the fingernail of his longest finger. In vain he attempted to hook his fingernail under some projection and thus draw it up. The meat was too far down. A stick. But he had no stick. The dipper. But it was fastened by a short chain to the grating. Perhaps with his leg that would reach down farther. But alas! His clumsy toes contrived only to push down the roast still farther. He wept. He gnashed his teeth. He would have liked to howl out loud. But no sound would he allow to come from his mouth. He rolled around in agony on the cold floor. Too short to permit him to lie at full length. Another torture that had been only too well calculated. He tried in vain to kill himself by breathing water up his nose. He could not do it. The will in him to breathe air was too great. If he could have wound the dipper chain around his neck. But no, nothing would succeed. It was days, weeks, months, years before there were sounds again above him. But no voice cried out tauntingly to him this time. He heard as if in a daze. For he was weak from lack of food. A heavy body fall into his cell. Then the footsteps mounted upwards and a door was closed. Not a ray of light came into the cell during this procedure. As soon as the door had closed, he threw himself like a wild man on that which had fallen into his chamber. It was a large piece of raw meat fat with suet. He buried his teeth in it, and lay sick and belching afterward. He had striven hard to keep track of time. He dozed so often and was so famished waiting for food that he figured he was being fed once a week, instead of 3 times a week as he actually was. He had counted a year when scarcely 4 months had passed. He had counted 4 years when one was hardly over. And then he began to lose track. He ceased to hope each day that there would be a great clashing above of iron on iron, and that Poton's rough voice would cry out, "Jahan, dear brother, are you there?" That would never happen. Insensibly, by stages too gradual to portray, he reached a state where he thought of nothing. In his underground cell there was never a change of temperature. Outside, the winter storms might howl, or summer thundershowers beat upon a parched earth. Within, it was forever cool, forever moist, forever dark. Nothing mattered to him now but food. He had grown to be hungry at the same hour 3 times a week, and then if the meat was late in being cast in, he would bark and bay like a dog. Years passed. Now and then a Pitamont fell afoul the Pitavals. Now and then it was the turn of the Pitamonts to execute a bloody revenge for brother Jehan, they would say, thinking him dead this many a year. And thus time passed and was gathered into seasons, and years were grouped into decades. Fully 50 years had passed since that night that Jehan Pitamont had come as a monk to beg admittance to the castle of the Pitavals, and still out in the courtyard 3 times a week the old master of the castle, his great bulk bent with age, went with his keys and his steward and opened the door of the superstructure leading to the ventilating chamber above, the oubliette. "Let us wait a moment or two," Pitaval would say to his steward and smile. "It is precisely noon by the shadow," said the steward. "If we delay but a minute or two, he will begin to howl," said Pitaval, and nodded his head in pleasant anticipation. One day, at his office in Avignon, old Datini the banker took a sheaf of papers from his files and said that it was time to settle this Pitaval and Pitamont business. "I have not seen a groat of the money due me in 2 years, from either of those 2 snarling kennels. It is time we brought this matter to a conclusion." The journey to the mountains was long, but Datini did not mind. He beguiled himself with a copy of Petrarch's sonnets to Laura. Moreover, he promised himself the pleasure of stopping off at Vaucluse on his way back and visiting the fountain there, immortalized in one of Petrarch's verses. Thus one day the Pitavals were privileged to entertain a visitor who turned them out of their house. Indeed, there was not much to be turned out. It was years since a horse had neighed in the stables. Of the family there was left only the shriveled giant of former years. Of servants there was only the steward, too old and weak himself to seek fortune elsewhere. They received Datini and his bailiffs with courtesy. "It is lucky you have come," said old Pitaval. "We slaughtered our last pig yesterday. If you have brought food along, we are prepared to welcome you." Datini had brought food with him. They ate and discussed business. "I have relatives in Orange," said Pitaval. "I think I shall go there." A lugubrious howling, seeming to come out of the bowels of the earth, filled the hall. "Do not be frightened, Master Datini," said Pitaval with a smile. "It is only a wolf that we keep in a pit in the courtyard. Here," he said, turning to his servant, "take him this piece of meat." Then he added, "Have we any rat bane? Then smear some on the meat, and we shall be rid of a useless pet." "A wolf," said Datini sententiously, "prefers death to captivity anyhow." "Aye," Pitaval agreed. "A wolf. But this one has little spirit and thinks only of his meat. Well, I am ready to leave. Your factors may take charge at once." He rose heavily. The howling had ceased abruptly. "There is no such hurry required of you," Datini returned. "I have still business to do with the Pitamonts across the way." "So? Are my friends over there to share my fate? Then I shall have pleasant companionship on my departure." "Shame on you to speak thus of 2 old ladies," said Datini. "I think I shall let them stay there the rest of their days. They are both over 70. A few hours later, as Pitaval and his steward were ready to leave their packs on their backs like the lowest of peasants, an old woman came hurrying up to them. "Sir," she cried, throwing herself on her knees and clasping her arms about the legs of old Pitaval, "you will not be so cruel as to leave this land and not tell me where my poor Jehan lies buried." "How could I be so cruel?" Pitaval protested, secretly giving his steward a nudge in the ribs. "Here," he said, "is the key to the vault in which he lies buried. No king ever had a more fitting tomb. Nor monk either," he added. "In the rear courtyard you will find a door to which this fits. Come to think of it, it is strange that there should still exist and function in Genoa an asylum for poor children founded by this Datini, and that snot-nosed bambinos of that town should there enjoy the money that Datini made on the Pitavals and the Pitamonts. For it was the severe Genoan businessmen whom Datini put in charge on the former estates of the warring families who decided that lumbering would pay best and make quickest returns. The results were that Datini was repaid, and that the region was permanently impoverished by erosion of the topsoil. Records of any Pitavals in the following centuries are scarce. In fact, I find only one, Gaët de Pitaval in the 18th century, who wandered up from Lyon to Paris and led a wretched existence as a law clerk, writing some miserable gossipy works on the side. It was not, in fact, until he had the brilliant inspiration to gather into a volume the gory tales of crime and detection that he picked up around the courts of law that his fortune changed. And he became known all over Europe. Think of it. He had the only volume of detective stories on the continent. He had imitators enough in a short while but managed to publish some 12 volumes to follow up his success. The German translation of his compilation carried an introduction by Schiller. Although practically unknown today, the army of detective story writers that have enriched themselves since his discovery should tax themselves to erect him a statue in gold. As to the Pitamants, we shall keep them company through the rest of this book, and recognize them despite their disguises. In Celtic pit means point or peak. Pitaval and Pitamont might be rendered as peak downstream and peak upstream, or peak in the vale and peak on the mount. As recently as 1903, there appeared in Germany a series called Pitaval der Gegenwart, the present-day Pitaval. Lately the bookstalls have carried a volume called Der Prager Pitaval, Criminal Stories of Prague. Chapter 2. Whoever has looked into Favre's excellent history of the morality police of Europe has not failed, I am certain, to notice and store in his mind that particularly striking case which Favre with grim, some will think it cheap, sense of humor entitled, "Suffer Little Children to Come Unto Me." The case that Lieutenant Galliez considers briefly on page 3 of his defense is evidently the same, although no names are mentioned except that of Pitamont. Favre's description is very complete and precise as to names and dates. I follow his account in the main. In the early 1850s in Paris, there dwelt a widow by the name of Madame Didier. Her husband and she had come from the provinces and he had established himself in the jewelry business. He was successful in a fair way and left his wife well situated when he died. They had just moved to one of the fine new apartment houses on the Boulevard Beaumarchais not far from the Boulevard de Filles du Calvaire. There is a particular reason for mentioning that, for in this adjoining street, there lived and officiated a priest by the name of Pitamont who was Madame Didier's favorite father confessor. Madame Didier dwelt pretty much alone, except for the frequent visits of a nephew, a young man who had been badly wounded in the street fighting in February 48, and since had devoted himself to pamphleteering in support of Napoleon. The latter's rapid veering toward conservatism and imperialism had been a little bit too much for Madame Didier's nephew, who still retained his hatred of the church and the aristocracy. For the moment he was undecided whether to follow his leader or continue along his own course. At this time, Madame Didier took into her house a young girl of about 13 or 14, an orphan from her own home village. Josephine had been recommended to her by the mayor of the village as a good and dutiful girl who would be useful to her in the household. The nephew was sitting by the window and looking out on the street. It was a warm day, unseasonably so for the middle of March. The sky had suddenly become overcast. "I say, is it going to rain?" he exclaimed. "Do you think so?" Madame Didier asked. Just then there came the rumble of thunder and in the distance the play of lightning was visible. "Do you hear that?" the nephew replied. "Bon Dieu!" Madame Didier ejaculated. "And I have not a drop of holy water in the house." "Holy water?" her nephew laughed. "Good heavens, you don't still practice that nonsense, do you? You save your sarcasm for your pamphlets, my friend," his aunt returned calmly. "I've always sprinkled holy water about when a thunderstorm threatened. Do you wish us all to be struck by lightning?" She laid aside her knitting needles. "My mother did the same, and she lived to be 80. But whom can I send?" she wondered suddenly. "Françoise is out." Françoise was the cook, and the only other person of the household. "Send Josephine," the nephew suggested, "unless you want to wait until I hobble there and back." "But Josephine has been here only 3 days," she objected. "She doesn't know her way about yet." "Good Lord, you don't have to know all Paris in order to go around the corner." So Josephine, the little girl from the provinces, was called and given explicit directions how to get to the little chapel around the corner and find Father Pitamont. "And hurry, please," said Madame Didier, as another burst of thunder resounded through the room. Josephine ran out, and directly into the thick of a violent thunder shower. Breathless, she raced around the corner, repeating to herself over and over again the directions Madame Didier had given her, and thus she reached the chapel and almost flung herself headlong into the dark interior. She was wet to the skin. Her garments clung to her, revealing her slender, feminine form. Her breasts had but begun to grow. They caused her light dress to swell up. The nipples were hard with chill and chafing. Of late they pained her. Françoise had said to her sagely, "You have growing pains, everyone has them." Lit by the golden light of the flickering candles, she made an enticing picture, thought Father Pitaval. He stood for a second and watched her, particularly her heaving, tumultuous breast. Before he could catch himself, he was overtaken by a wave of desire that shut off the voice of his conscience. "What is it, my little girl?" he said, and came out from the pillar behind which he had been standing, frightened and now completely at a loss. An incomprehensible flood of words tumbled from her lips. "Why, you are all chilled," he said kindly. "Come and warm yourself up with a glass of wine." He ushered her gently back into the sacristy, poured out 2 generous portions of consecrated wine, and made her drink one while he himself emptied the other. Dazed and dizzied, she permitted him to fondle her and press her close to his cassock. She was warm there and comforted, but her fright rose again when she felt him touch her in precisely the way Françoise, but the day before, had been warning her not to allow anyone to touch her. Now she wished to release herself, but her limbs were as if paralyzed. She struggled a little, but his strength was greater, and he kept pouring strange, consoling words into her ear. She permitted him to lead her to the couch and do with her as he pleased. She left without saying a word of her mission. Indeed, she had quite forgotten the original purpose of her coming. In her ears resounded only the father's oft and insistently repeated caution that she must never utter a word of what had happened. He had made her swear by the cross. The thunder shower had just ceased when Josephine returned. She came walking in, looking around out of wide-opened eyes, one finger pulling down her lower lip, as if she could no longer recognize her surroundings. "Why, what is the matter with you, Josephine?" Madame Didier asked. She had been only a trifle worried at Josephine's absence, and that largely because she reproached herself for not seeing to it that the girl took her cloak along. When Josephine had not returned at once, Madame Didier had surmised that, caught in the thunderstorm, the girl had taken refuge and would return when the rain had abated, which was precisely what happened. But why should she return as if she had seen the devil in person? But Josephine would not answer and only shook her head. "Come, Josephine, do not play the stubborn. Tell me what is the matter with you." Still the girl only shook her head. "She has caught a cold." "That's it," Madame Didier exclaimed. "Why, your clothes are dry." "No, they are a little damp. Tell me, were you caught in the rain? Or did you get to the chapel in time to miss the worst of it? Good heavens, why won't the child answer?" Still Josephine made no reply. Then Madame Didier lost her patience and declared, roughly shaking her, "Then go to bed at once, and don't let me see you again until you find your tongue. Come now, my dear aunt." Her nephew spoke up from his chair by the window. "Give the little girl a chance. Before you were all for thinking her incapable of going around the corner. Perhaps she really did lose her way. Let me talk to her." But his efforts were no more successful than those of his aunt. Finally Madame Didier said, as if the idea were an inspiration from on high, "I know, she shall come with me to Father Pitaval. Surely she will not refuse to talk to him." And truly her words were inspired, for all of a sudden Josephine let out a torrent of words, but so intermingled with sobs that one could make neither head nor tail of them. At the same time she threw herself down on the floor as if possessed. Madame Didier was herself so taken aback that she could not summon her wits. But her nephew, fed on anti-clerical literature, cried out at once, "What did he do to you?" "He did what Françoise said I shouldn't," Josephine cried out, redoubling her sobs. The nephew laughed sardonically. "So that's your Father Pitaval. Pretty bird." "But I don't understand what Father Pitaval has to do with this," Madame Didier expostulated, completely at sea. The nephew was suddenly resolved. Now was the time to break with Napoleon, who was at the moment off on a visit to the Pope, and throw this juicy bit of scandal into the public pot. He was so taken by his resolution that he forgot the matter at hand, and rose from his chair by the aid of his stick, determined to seek out the editor of La Solidarite. Madame Didier, however, would not let him go until she had learned what all this business meant, and when she had heard, again she would not let him depart, until she had sworn him not to say a word of it to anyone. Her reason was that the child was hysterical, and that it would never do to believe her until the matter had been more fully investigated. His reason was simpler, all or at least most of his money came from his aunt, and further, he hoped to inherit from her some day. He could not afford to be a political pamphleteer without his aunt's support. Madame Didier, however, herself went to the chapel and seeing no one about, boldly knocked at the door to the sacristy. Receiving no answer, she entered. Father Pitaval was asleep on a couch. Asleep, he no longer looked the holy man she had usually taken him to be. He seemed old and coarse. His heavy features, particularly his bushy eyebrows, joined together by a heavy growth of hair above his nose, lent him a strange, almost beastly expression. In that moment Madame Didier almost believed, but restrained herself for fear of doing him an injustice. Feeling the weight of her glance upon him, he opened his eyes. "Why, madam, it is you," he exclaimed, and rose at once. Cutting short his greeting, she plunged quickly into her story. He nodded his head as if the matter were grave and interesting, but of no special concern to him. "A young girl of about 14, you say?" he asked, as if he were trying to recall whether he had perhaps not seen such a girl somewhere. At that moment, Madame Didier spied her benetier, the vessel which she had given Josephine to hold the precious holy water. It was lying on the floor near the couch. At once he saw it too. How could he have forgotten to remove that? Throwing aside the role he had assumed, he cast himself at her feet. But she rose hastily and ran out, overcome with horror. She disregarded the advice of her nephew, and made no complaint to the police, but went instead to the bishop and laid her case before him, with the result that Father Pitaval was called to account. The bishop, however, contented himself with transferring the culprit to another parish. There he had soon made a bad reputation for himself. The truth was that he could no longer hold himself in check. His temptations led him ever further astray into the world of sin. At night he slipped out of his cassock and, dressed in civilian clothes, frequented the most disreputable haunts of the city. One night Madame Didier, leaving the theatre late with her nephew, caught sight of him entering a voiture de place, gallantly helping in a young lady first. The broad expression of pleasure on his face, the extreme of fashion in which the young lady was clad, lacy décolleté without shoulder straps, leaving her shoulders and bosom bare down to just above the line of her nipples, long, tight skirt flaring at the ankles, all this left little doubt as to the nature of the commerce that obtained between these two. Madame Didier shuddered. Her nephew had the kindness to make no comment. Subsequently she learned that Pitaval had been reported to his superiors again and again, and was finally requested either to make a lengthy retreat among the forever silent Trappists, or lay down his frock. Pitaval expressed his decision by disappearing suddenly along with some valuable articles belonging to the church to which he was last attached. "We are well rid of him," thought Madame Didier. In truth she was far from being rid of Father Pitaval, although she never saw him again. Her nephew, Aymar Galliez, had of late given up his own rooms and moved over to his aunt's apartment. This was partly to save money and partly to be near his aunt, for his badly healed wounds left him a prey to fits of melancholy in which he could not bear solitude. He was sitting at his favorite place near the window one day and making an occasional note on a pad of paper. He had the itch to distinguish himself in the field of literature, but was not quite sure of the form of the great work which he proposed to write. So many fine things were appearing lately in all lines. Only recently the younger Dumas had electrified Paris with his Dame Aux Camelius, and a revolution in writing was taking place. Those in the know were all talking excitedly about the new way of writing. The password was realism. He was being annoyed by the constant entry and exit of Josephine. "What the deuce can that girl be wanting in here every minute?" he asked himself irritably, for like all melancholic natures, much as he hated solitude, he was irritated by the presence of others. but after a while he became interested in the girl herself, wondering if here were not the subject for an incisive little sketch. A young girl seduced by a priest and thereupon rejected by her legitimate suitor. Or perhaps one might have the girl fall in love with the priest and he abandon his religion in order to marry her. But that was all old stuff. He had read countless things of the sort. The trouble with literature was that every subject had been done. There was nothing new for the pen to tackle. As his thoughts ran on so, he almost forgot the girl. Gradually, however, he began to notice her strange demeanor. There could be no doubt of it, she was trying to attract his attention. Though ostensibly engaged in straightening the room and tidying up, she turned toward him every few moments, looked at him with big eyes, then suddenly looked away as if abashed. Meanwhile her body contorted itself in a positively indecent fashion. Her torso was in constant, sinuous motion like the body of a snake. Her breast rose and fell as she sighed audibly. When she saw that he was looking at her, she ceased. But a moment later she came up to him and, picking up a piece of paper from the floor, she asked, "Is this yours?" And when he thanked her, she continued, "Shall I open the window a little more?" And again, "Are the curtains blowing in your way?" All of which he found most annoying. In leaning across his little table to reach the curtains and tie them back, she brought her young body up against his face. He breathed the warmth of her flesh. Despite himself, he felt a powerful compulsion. Thoroughly disturbed, he found some excuse or other to dismiss the girl and remained for a long time incapable of concentrating on his literary endeavors. The report of this theft to the police uncovered the whole tale and thus came to the knowledge of Favre, who included it among the various cases in the chapter, "Suffer Little Children to Come Unto Me." Chapter 3. One day as he was hobbling out, the door to the kitchen opened and Aymar heard himself called softly by Françoise. "Am Aymar puzzled?" He turned around. She beckoned him mysteriously to come into the kitchen and, when he had followed her call, she first closed the door and then whispered to him, "Do you know what terrible things are happening here?" "Why, no," he said innocently. "I mean about Josephine." "Why, what's the trouble with her?" He had wanted to say, "Why, what's the trouble with her again?" but had restrained himself, not being quite sure that Françoise had been informed of the Pitaval affair, Madame Didier having been so anxious to keep the matter quiet. "Her conduct is, how shall I say, Monsieur, c'est un dévergondé." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the butcher's boy, the concierge's young son, the greengrocer, himself, everybody, simply everybody has had her. And if they have not had her, then it was only because they were decent enough to refuse. Yet, Monsieur, I never thought that would happen to this house. A young country girl. Why, when she came here she acted as if she didn't know A from B. Monsieur, the whole neighborhood is talking about it." "Are you sure of this?" said Aymar, though he himself was convinced at once. "How do you know that this is not simply malicious gossip?" She then told him how she had seen things with her own eyes. How she had caught the girl and the concierge's son up in the garret in a manner that left no doubt. Thereafter she had forbidden the girl to leave the house, but she had run away. Of course people would say there was another girl ruined by the wicked city, but she knew better. That girl must have brought those habits with her from the country. Aymar let her talk on, wondering himself, could it be that that first display of bewilderment and grief and shame had been mere acting on Josephine's part? No. Impossible. The girl had been pure before. It was Father Pitaval who had unleashed this beast in her body. The mayor of Madame Didier's own home village would never have recommended a girl with a bad character. "What I want you to tell me, Monsieur, is how I shall break the news to Madame. I'm afraid to go to her with all this trouble. She has had sorrow enough, poor Madame." "Leave that to me," Aymar consoled her. "I'll take care of everything." "Yes, but do it at once, for who knows what may happen. Last night I woke up and found her gone from our bed. I waited, thinking she had gone out for only a moment, but when she didn't come back, I got out of bed and looked for her. I must tell you, Monsieur, that she was not in the house at all. She had unlocked the door and gone out. It must be Jeanette, the concierge's son, who unlocked the door downstairs for her. I fell asleep again, and when I woke up, she was back in bed and denied that she had ever been out. What shall we do with such a creature?" "Leave it to me," Aymar said again, and wondered what he could do. But that evening Josephine waited on them at the dinner table as usual, and as usual she brought herself annoyingly into contact with Aymar. Nevertheless, her girlish face expressed nothing but purity and innocence. How could those tender, immature lineaments have expressed anything else? When she had retired to the kitchen and was busy with her own meal, and with the washing of the dishes, Aymar opened up on his aunt. Do you see any change in Josephine since that terrible event? Fortunately, no. She seems to have gotten over it, and I hope will soon have completely forgotten it. Do you really think she was an innocent thing when she came here? Why, yes, of course. What makes you ask? Just so. She pursued a pleasant thought of her own. Josephine had been the cause of the seduction, and Father Pitaval had fallen to her wiles. But at the very moment she thought thus, she realized that it couldn't be so. Pitaval's subsequent actions did not endorse this view. Why do you ask? She repeated. Her behavior has not been irreproachable of late. He understated the matter, entering the thin edge of the wedge before he pounded home. What has she done? Madame Didier asked. He told her in a few words, reducing the case to its minimum and omitting all embellishments likely to cause Madame Didier to worry too much. Madame Didier remained in thought for a while and then decided sagely that Josephine should be put in a room somewhere where she would be safe and watched over, and where she would remain until the mayor of her village acted upon her case. Pull the bell for Françoise, and we'll see if she knows of some good house where we can keep the girl. Françoise appeared and listened to her mistress' decision. Meanwhile she fidgeted about and cast certain glances at Aymar Galliez, as if to say, there is something else I must tell you about, until Aymar could not help exclaiming, come right out with it, Françoise. Françoise sucked in her breath as if to gather courage, then jerking back her head with self-righteousness. She certainly wasn't to blame for anything. She delivered herself of this. Josephine is pregnant. There was a moment of deep silence, then particulars were demanded. Since when? Françoise couldn't say, but from what Josephine had told her it might be 2-3 months. Why, she has been here only 3 months, Madame Didier exclaimed. Oui, madame, said the obedient Françoise. It's that damned F.A. A look from his aunt made Aymar cut his sentence short. Bring her in, Françoise, I'll talk to her alone, said Madame Didier. A moment later Josephine came in, simply clad, demure, the bloom of rustic innocence still on her cheeks. Only when she happened to look up did her dark, blazing eyes belie her modesty and humility. My poor child, said Madame Didier, and put her hands on Josephine's shoulders. Do you know that you are going to have a baby? Oui, madame. And you are so young. Oui, madame. You poor thing. Is it because I go with the boys like Françoise says, madame? Oh, child, why do you do that? I like it so, madame. Must I really stop? I've tried very hard not to do it, but I can't stop myself. At home I saw all the animals do it and no one ever stopped them. But Josephine, my child, we are not animals. You never saw human beings do such things, did you? No, madame. There was only mamma and myself at home. Yes, to be sure, said Madame Didier and bit her lip. Don't men and women do it ever? Hush. But Father Pitaval was the first to do it to me. Hush, hush. Was he really the first? Yes, madame. You unfortunate wretch. What shall we do with you now? Françoise says you will send me away because I am bad. Don't send me away. I shall find a nice home for you. She was thinking of the Duchess of Angoulême's home for wayward girls. But a second's thought brought her to the decision not to attempt to put the girl in a home. She wanted as little explaining as possible in the case. The best thing to do was to take the matter upon herself completely, give Josephine as good a room to stay in as could be found, and let things take their natural course. All wounds heal over in time, and those that are not healed are covered by the grave. Josephine seemed to have quite resigned herself to her fate. It was only for the first few days that she suffered from lack of her nightly escapades. Here, in the room they had found for her, there was no running away at night or, indeed, at any time, but to compensate for that there was nothing to do, and in all the years of her life Josephine had been busy from early morn to night, not only at the little poverty-stricken farm where she had lived with her widowed mother, but also at Madame Didier's, where under the stern direction of Françoise there was a constant succession of tasks to keep her actively at work all day long. This sudden leisure was the first ray of sunlight in her short and bleak existence. She lolled around doing nothing and was quite happy at it. She sat by the window and pretended she was Aymar Galliez, sat silently thus for hours. Mealtime she enjoyed the fullest. Not that she was a glutton, but being waited upon was to her such a novel experience that she could never have enough of it. And being called madam by the girl who brought in her tray, a young girl much like what she herself had been but a few days before. Josephine did her best to act like Madame Didier. Being thus by turns Madame Didier and then Aymar Galliez, Josephine had really quite a nice time of it. And when every second day or so Françoise came to see her, she could not prevent herself from putting on little airs before Françoise, who was still Françoise, whereas she, Josephine, was now Madame. And feeling herself thoroughly in her role, it annoyed her considerably that, once in front of the servant girl, Françoise should speak quite openly of our mistress. Josephine felt she had been humbled. Occasionally, but rarely, being a woman of great weight, Mère Kardec ascended to the top floor of her maison d'accouchement to visit her most curious patient, a young girl who was not to give birth for some 5 months. Mère Kardec was a stern-visaged person, square-hewn as if a stone carver had left her unfinished. She asked no questions. Her fortune had been acquired by her absolute lack of curiosity. The women who came to her house could be sure of being well taken care of. Mère Kardec sent a constant stream of children out to her relations in Brittany, and the mothers who left her place need never concern themselves about the matter again, beyond paying the required sums. A countess with a name known all over Europe might come to Mère Kardec's and register as whatever she pleased and have twins if nature so ordained, and Mère Kardec would make it right with the authorities, and never a word of it would go beyond her doors. 1,000 romances on the brink of scandal or tragedy had come for salvation here behind the inconspicuous exterior of her house. Even the Almanach de Gotha must have its cesspool or sewerage system. When Mère Kardec entered Josephine's room, she unloosened her dour visage and emitted a greeting to which she expected no answer. If one came, as in the present case, when polite words came tripping from Josephine's tongue, Mère Kardec paid no attention. She passed her hand over the furniture to see if the servants were cleaning properly. She jabbed at the bed to see if the feather mattress had been well shaken up, and looked under the bed for those fluffy accumulations of feathers, hair and dust that tend to gather there. Having satisfied herself as to this, she asked curtly about the satisfactoriness of the food, and without waiting for more than a sentence of the answer she excused herself and walked out. To make up for these cold visits, there was the weekly call by Madame Didier herself, accompanied by Aymar Galliez. Aymar sat down at once by the window. Sometimes he was much shaken by the arduous walk up the many flights of stairs, and this not only because the climb was difficult but because the hall was often full of the horrible moans of women in labor. He sat by the open window and wiped his brow with his kerchief. Josephine could not take her eyes off his pale, thin face, his long delicate fingers, his silken handkerchief moistened with perspiration. Once he came alone. Then she was so shy that he could not get a single clear response from her. Finally he arose to go, but she threw herself toward the door as if to bar his way, and taking his hand in hers she begged, "Don't go. Don't go yet." She slung her arms around his body and cuddled up close. He put his hands on her shoulders and said gently, "Why, Josephine, pull yourself together." She did not answer but continued to cling to him. Then, still holding her by the shoulders, he sought to push her away. Only her head went back and her eyes looked up into his. Without knowing why, he bent and kissed her chastely on the lips. "Kiss me again," her eyes begged. He obeyed. Then her tongue darted out of her mouth and pushed itself between his lips. Her hot moist tongue stirred him to the depths of his bowels. Weak with sudden lust, he subsided on the bed with her. Downstairs before her office stood Mère Kardec like the threat of doom, arms akimbo, glaring straight ahead. Aymar shrank within himself as he came in sight of her. He thought she was about to say something to him, but not a sound came from her firm lips. She had no intention of saying anything as a matter of fact, but he, conscious of his guilt, slunk away like a whipped cur. On his way home he came to the decision that there was only one way out for him, and that was never to go to see Josephine again. Having so determined, his conscience was soothed and his ego revived from the chilling shower Mère Kardec had administered. At home across the table Madame Didier said, "You look exhausted, my poor Aymar. You shall not go there again." He controlled his great fright. "On the contrary," he assured her, "I feel exceedingly well. And if the long walk there and back has exhausted me I shall sleep all the better." And after a moment he added, "It is you who are looking peaked, my aunt. Why, don't you run away to the country for a while? You should not have given up your plans for a vacation this year." She objected that with conditions as they were, and what with Josephine and the fact that in any case she would not return to her village where she had usually spent her summers, all this made a vacation in the country impossible. He argued with her persuasively, and so well as a trained pamphleteer like himself could do, that she capitulated. 2 days later he had the pleasure of seeing his aunt and Françoise off to the south. A moment after the train had pulled out he was in a fiacre and on his way to Josephine. This time there were no preliminaries. They clutched at each other like two struggling in dark water and about to be engulfed. He could not suppress a feeling of joy when he learned that Madame Didier was feeling very poorly and had been advised by the doctor to extend her stay in the midi as long as possible. "What kind of a monster am I?" he asked himself, and gazed at himself in horror. He shut himself up in his room determined to work on that great opus of his, to which he had not put a hand for weeks. He looked out of his window down on the hot August boulevard. Men and women, horses and cabs, drenched in the sun, hastened by in both directions. What was the meaning of all this? His mind was empty of any thoughts. The whole world had no meaning. Nothing but hot dust, searing colors, people who did not know what they were about. He changed his mind about not going, and at once the world took on order and meaning. When he was out on the street, hastening like everyone else, then he found that the streets were not so hot as he had feared. A cool breeze was blowing. It was a balmy day with a climate such as one imagines is eternal in paradise. "Why do you never say a word about Josephine in your letters?" his aunt reproached him. "Don't you ever go to see her? You know I wanted you to watch out for her." He saw that he had made a big mistake. She must not be suspicious. And there was Mayor Kardec, who could have told her that he had been there every day and sometimes twice. "I remembered your injunction concerning Josephine," he wrote slyly. "I have been to see her often. When I go to see my friend Le Pelletier as I do now and then, or when I go to see the group at the Café Palisade, then since I am passing by there anyhow, I usually drop in to see how she is faring. Indeed, she has been quite well up until now." The facts were true enough. The implication was a clever lie. He detested himself for stooping to such procedure. No longer could he have shouted that, "Damn Father Pitaval, that devil in priest's garb." He felt himself to be as low as rascally, nay even lower than Pitaval. At the club it was noticed that he no longer inveighed so fiercely against priest and capitalist. He had come to the consoling thought that we are all sinners together. That was the only excuse he could find for himself. As for Josephine, now that she had him, she would not let him go. She could not bear his absence, and when he had to go she would make him swear to return at such and such a definite time, insisting that she would throw herself out of the window if he were but a minute late. The child she carried troubled her much by its liveliness and prevented her from sleeping at night. But when Aymar was around she forgot completely about the small pleasure which she had had at first on finding herself treated as madam and with no work to do had palled on her. There was for her only one satisfaction in life, and that was being with Aymar. Late in October Madame Didier returned. Aymar promptly settled into a melancholia from which nothing could arouse him. Apathetically he listened to Madame Didier's tales of her experiences in the south. Twice he ventured to make a visit to Josephine, but his nerves were so jumpy from fear of exposing the whole sordid connection that he stopped completely thereafter. The last time, indeed, he saw Françoise mounting the stairs as he was coming down. Fortunately, she had not seen him yet and he had time to step into a dark recess which she passed unsuspectingly. Shattered by this experience he took to bed for a whole day. Josephine, realizing that now everything was over, and unable to deceive herself long with the pleasant thought that after the birth of the child she would be able to return to the old conditions, demeaned herself like one gone insane and threatened so often to commit suicide that at last Mayor Kardec transferred her to a room where the window was barred and took the additional precaution of leaving a nurse in the room both day and night. And now the babe within her never stopped squirming and kicking and gave Josephine not a second. Chapter 4. One day late in December, to be precise on the 23rd, Madame Didier and Aymar sat at the dinner table and ate with little appetite and conversed desultorily. Aymar ate out of some vague sense of duty, while Madame Didier had, ever since her girlhood, been accustomed to eat whatever was set before her, and finish it down to the last particle, a trait that the French are fond of instilling in their children, perhaps to give the lie to the notion that the French are a race of gourmets. Suddenly Madame Didier spoke up. You know, I am beginning to be worried. What about? Of course you will think me superstitious. No fear, said Aymar ironically. You? Superstitious? Never. Now don't make fun, Aymar. I have seen a good deal more of the world than you have. What, for example? Do you believe in Christmas? Of course I do, said Aymar. Everybody believes that Christmas comes on the 25th of this month, and they are one and all right. If you will stop your silly jesting, I'll go on. Do go on. I've always wanted to know about Christmas. Do you believe that the animal world is conscious of the coming of Christmas? In spite of himself, Aymar smiled. Are you going to tell me that the cattle kneel in their stalls on Christmas night? That is precisely what I am going to tell you, and more, that I have seen it with my own eyes. Of course you have seen it. Anyone going into a stable any night of the year can see some, or, if he is lucky, all of the cattle kneeling. I knew you were going to say that, but it isn't true. And what is more, I went one night, as the birth of our Savior was approaching, and heard the bees sing in their hives. Bees always sing in their hives. Come, Aymar, in the dead of winter bees certainly don't sing in their hives. And you say you heard them? If you can't get me one way, you will have me another. Is that it, Aymar? Disconcerted because she had worsted him, he remained silent for a moment and then brought the conversation back to the beginning. And so that is why you are worried? No, of course not. What worries me is that Josephine is about to be delivered, and as like as not it may be at the very hour of our Lord's birth. Why should that distress you? I should think, on the contrary, that you would see reason to rejoice. It is because I am superstitious, if you like me to put it that way. But let me tell you this. I knew a man who came to no good end, and it had always been said of him that he was doomed from the beginning, for he had been born on Christmas Eve. And naturally everybody did his little bit to make it come true, said Aymar bitterly. Do you number me among those? Madame Didier reproached him, and went on rapidly. And in our village and in other villages where the people are God-fearing, the wives stay away from their husbands during most of the month of March and a week or so of the month of April, in order that they may not have children born on that day. Now, will you tell me what sense you can see in that practice? I spoke only of superstition, my dear Aymar, but if you wish me to speak of sense, which is more rightly your province, I suppose, then I have this to say. When people believe in a thing, they like to show their respect for it. Have noticed that the first thing the revolutionaries do, after they have torn down a lot of old statues, is erect a lot of new ones, and after they have ruled out a lot of old holidays, institute a lot of new ones. I don't suppose that would strike you as being superstitious. That is neither here nor there, said Aymar. Very well, Madame Didier continued, but you will grant that people like to show their respect for what they believe in, and those who believe in the beautiful and gentle life of Christ like to honor him. Now tell me, can they practice any finer act of homage than the renunciation of carnal conception during that period when the Virgin Mary conceived immaculately? Tell me, must not even such as you admire therein a refinement of taste and a delicacy of worship which has no parallel in your modern boisterous attachment to one political leader after another? It is not lacking in beauty, Aymar admitted, but what does it mean? It means as much as all your cockades and colors and speeches, Madame Didier retorted. What do you mean? How many times in my life has blood been shed here in France in order that people should be happier, in order that there should be no more poor? I cannot see that anyone is any better off for all this fighting. You have told me that you see no meaning in politics, but you still haven't told me what sense there is to worrying about a child being born on Christmas Eve. Aymar, my dear nephew, is it not already enough of evil that Josephine should bear the child of a priest? Is that not already enough of an insult to heaven? That a priest should be guilty of such misconduct, without adding to this sad birth the characteristic of being a mockery of the birth of Christ. In spite of himself, Aymar was moved. That's a Mother Goose story, he said, irritably. In my opinion, Madame Didier continued, Josephine was an innocent little girl, but when the devil tempted Father Pitaval, he did not spare her. The devil is in her now, and I see it every time I go there. She is dangerous. Nonsense, said Aymar, but he was startled nevertheless, somewhat unnerved, and more than a little vexed. He wished to stop the conversation and therefore rose with the excuse that he had to get back to his writing. He retired to his room and lit his quinquet lamp, but he had no desire to work on the story he had chosen to tell, namely, that of a young man who strives to lead the world on to happiness for all and who succeeds only in losing his life. Annoyed, he pushed away the sheets of paper. The world is too big to be cramped up in a book, he said. Then he wondered, why had he no ability to stick to what he had decided to do? After all, the idea wasn't a bad one, and people didn't expect you to put the world into a volume. This was now the 10th or 12th idea he had thrown into the discard. Every time a new book appeared and drew to itself the plaudits of the critics, then he found it to be on a subject he had once thought of doing himself, an idea that he had rejected for one paltry reason or another. He leaned over on his desk and rested his head on his outstretched arms. So, Josephine was going to have a baby in a day or so. What did she look like now, with her body swollen to term? He could not picture her. In fact, he could not call her face to mind. What is it I have loved? He asked himself distractedly. If her image has already faded, what he had loved was a softness and a clinging warmth, a gentleness and a vivacity, and now she would have a baby and moan like those others he had heard as he climbed the steps of Mayor Kardec's maison d'accouchement. He found himself thinking of that baby, thinking of it with fondness and wishing that it were his own, wishing that he and the baby and Josephine were one family. Late the following night, Françoise returned from Mayor Kardec's. Well, Madame Didier asked. Not a sign yet, she reported to her mistress. Very well, Françoise, come, hurry up or we shall not find places for the midnight mass. And you, Aymar, you are not coming. I think not, my aunt, he mumbled, his mind occupied with a bold scheme. While they were secure in the packed church, he would slip over to Mayor Kardec's and be back before they returned. No sooner were they well off than he had hastened out toward the maison d'accouchement. Well known to all the servants, he had no trouble in being admitted despite the lateness of the hour and went upstairs as fast as his bad legs could carry him. A woman bustling out of Josephine's room with a large pail of red-tinted water caused him to stop in dismay. The first thought that struck him was that Josephine had died in agony. When the woman came back with her pail filled with fresh water, he appealed to her for a word of news, but she only smiled at him and entered, closing the door rapidly, before he could get a distinct view of what was inside. He had caught, however, a glimpse of Mayor Kardec and a man, the doctor evidently, for though Mayor Kardec was an accomplished midwife, she always called in a doctor. Aymar waited without for what seemed to him hours. In vain his mind strove to interpret the sounds he heard, sharp phrases, the swishing of water and feet moving back and forth. Suddenly there was a piercing scream, a long drawn-out, blood-curdling yell that wound and wound, growing shriller and shriller, stopping suddenly with a deep dark gurgle as though all that vast sound were being sucked back and down into a waste pipe. The silence that followed was so intense that the shivering Aymar could hear the responses of the people in the church across the street. Even the tinkling of the bell announcing the miracle of the transubstantiation of the wafer and wine into flesh and blood could be heard distinctly. And precisely then another sound came from the room, the strangest, queerest squeaking and mewling. Thereafter came that same medley of rapid commands, the splashing of water, the clatter of pottery, all dull and low as if heard through a dream. Suddenly the door was pulled back and a tall man stepped out. Aymar pressed himself against the wall as if he would have liked to sink into it. But the tall man had seen him. So you're the fortunate father? Yes, Aymar stuttered. Well, let me be the first to congratulate you on the birth of a son. Is she dead? Aymar breathed. Who? The mother. He chuckled with professional satisfaction. Never had an easier case. Slipped out like a kitten. Work would be a round of pleasure for me if they were all as easy. But that scream. Bound to be a little pain, of course. Better not to see her now. She's sleeping. Come back in the morning. And with an amicable pat on the shoulder, he dismissed Aymar from his mind and hurried down the stairs. And Aymar, recalling all of a sudden how little time he had if he wished to get back before Madame Didier and Françoise returned from midnight mass, scuttled down after him. He had barely sat down in his favorite chair before the window when there was a noise at the door and Françoise and Madame Didier entered. It was marvelous, said Madame Didier. Aymar's natural question stuck in his throat. All he brought forth was a gurgle. Madame Didier began to look at him suspiciously. He pulled himself together and asked, "What was?" "The Mass, of course," she answered. "The sermon was so moving, so touching. One could have fancied oneself actually present at the birth. Why, what is the matter with you, Aymar? Why, your face is the color of cheese." "I'm a little tired," he said as calmly as he could. "I think I'll go to bed." "You're evading me," said Madame Didier severely. "Tell me now, where does it hurt you? What you need is a good tisane or some rhubarb." "No, no," he protested. "I'll be all well in the morning." She shook her head. "You don't take care of yourself," she declared. "I'll have to watch you more carefully." He shuddered. "Perhaps," she pursued, "you might have a vacation yourself. You know you haven't been out of Paris for over a year, and this city with more gas lamps every day is becoming really poisonous. No wonder. Everybody, especially women, are always fainting. When I was a girl, a woman was considered as strong as a man. Here I am forgetting all about you, thinking of my girlhood. Positively, I'm getting to rate odor like an old woman. Wait, I'll go fetch you some rhubarb." He submitted dully to the rhubarb pill for want of courage to argue against her. Early the next morning he was already itching to be off, but neither Françoise nor Madame Didier seemed to have any thought of going to Mère Cardec's. Their calmness irritated him. How could they go about their work so stodgily? Truly, women had no hearts. Josephine's scream still rang in his ears, as indeed it had done all night. All night he had rehearsed the sounds of his nocturnal experience. He heard the clanking of vessels filled with water. He heard the doctor's pleasantly rough voice cutting into Mère Cardec's bass. He saw the woman rushing out with that horrible pail of pink water in which he thought he could recall the sight of swirling streaks of deep red. He shivered. He was allowing his imagination to get the better of him. Finally, he heard Madame Didier call out, "Françoise! Françoise! How could we have forgotten?" He breathed with relief. He meant to propose to go with them just as soon as they broached the subject of going to see Josephine. But he heard his aunt continue, "There's all that linen in the chest. That's where those missing sheets must be." With deep disgust he heard the two women scurrying away toward the chest, which they opened with exclamations of surprise. They laughed and chatted about their amusing oversight, saying ever and again until Aymar thought he would die of rage, "How could we have forgotten? I never thought. I don't know what's coming over me." At noon the reason for the women's lack of interest was revealed. "Well, that's a stone off my heart," said Madame Didier to Françoise as she served the pot. "Oui, madame," said Françoise. "What's a stone off your heart?" Aymar asked. "The fact that we haven't heard from Mère Cardec." "Did you expect to hear from her?" Aymar managed to say, suddenly divining the whole situation. "Why, yes, she told Françoise yesterday that she would send a messenger this morning if anything happened during the night. Well, my worst fears are over. It won't be a Christmas baby." Aymar sputtered. "The soup's awfully hot," he said testily. "I thought I had asked you often enough to cool off my soup, Françoise." "Oui, monsieur," she said, visibly annoyed, and could not help adding as she ran out, her whole body quivering with anger, "The last time was 3 years ago." "How can you be so rude?" said Madame Didier, and she too was angry. "Oof!" he ejaculated, too exasperated to think of anything better, and he knew himself in the wrong, which was the worst of it. "Now everybody is going off to sulk in a corner," he complained. "Well, you have yourself to blame, and the sooner you make it right with her, the better." And so there was nothing for him to do but go back to the kitchen and wheedle Françoise back into good humor. This involved a flood of tears and many reminiscences on her part as to how she had been with the family for 30 years and had held Monsieur in her arms when he was just a baby and had used to wash his soiled linen often, because Madame Galliez was a weak woman and could not always afford a servant to help her, and other such details ad nauseum. Aymar forced himself to say, I know you and my aunt have been more than mothers to me. He forced himself to say that, not because it was not true, not because he did not appreciate what these two women had done for him, but because there are types of gratitude which will always be annoying to a man. When they came to the point of walking over to Mère Kardec's, Aymar declared that he would go along. He had wild visions of himself tearing in ahead of the women on one excuse or another, and warning Mère Kardec not to say a word of his visit on the previous night, for it was plain that the only reason she had not sent the messenger was because she figured that he would bring the news to the ladies. But no opportunity of tearing in ahead of the women afforded itself, and as for a plausible excuse, his mind, no matter how he tortured it, would not yield a single idea of value. So he walked along through the mildly wintry day, and tried his best to appear nonchalant while he journeyed to his doom, for his visit last night was bound to come out, and with it all his secret relationship, that relationship he was burning to resume, and which yet he could not acknowledge to himself without revulsion. Mère Kardec greeted the ladies in her usual stern manner, unbending only sufficiently to say, You will see Madame nursing her baby for the first time. In unison, Françoise and Madame Didier exclaimed, What? Her baby? When did she have her baby? Why did you not send a messenger as you promised? Aymar looked on calmly, as if the matter did not interest him, though he would have welcomed the proverbial yawning of the earth beneath his feet, to swallow him whole. Mère Kardec uttered no more than a, but I thought, monsieur. Even before she had finished the word monsieur, she had checked herself, and instead of explaining herself, she excused herself. Years of experience had taught her that one apology is worth a dozen explanations. The ladies, however, did not wait for much apology but hastened upstairs, followed by the perspiring but happy Aymar. He had been saved on the brink of the precipice. Nevertheless, he was to go home that afternoon a much disappointed man. 2 rude experiences awaited him. He did not mind that Josephine should not give him a second glance. He accounted readily for that as being due to the presence of Madame Didier and Françoise. But he had not been prepared for that baby, brought up with the belief that newborn babies were such as one sees born by Madonnas in Italian paintings, or such as are depicted in the canvases of Groys. He was shocked by the scrawny, spidery, fuzzy and wizened little monster that Josephine was gently hugging to her breast. As for the ladies, they went into ecstasies. When the 3 had said goodbye and had gone down one flight of stairs, Aymar suddenly bethought himself of a handkerchief he claimed to have forgotten, though it still reposed in his pocket, and before Françoise could say that she would fetch it for him, he had dashed up the stairs and re-entered the room. The little baby had been placed back in its basket, and Josephine was certainly free to give him one rapid passionate embrace, which was what he expected, or at the very least, seeing that she might still claim to be an invalid, a look of tenderness and promise. All he received was a quiet question as to the reason for his return, and her eyes, which formerly had blazed with ardor, were now quiet pools of maternal affection, entirely meaningless to him. He could not leave her thus. He stopped and said, Well, quoi, monsieur, she said. She had not meant the monsieur. It had returned to her naturally along with her changed attitude, but to him it was suddenly revelatory of the fact that she was no longer his mistress, but his servant. Thoughtfully he closed the door and followed his aunt down the stairs. At home, Aymar had the courage to twit his aunt about the terrible fate of children born on Christmas Eve. Actually, he was himself half willing to believe that there was something magical in all he had been through. No doubt about it, he had been bewitched. How else could he have let himself in for such a relationship right on the doorsteps of his aunt, so to speak? No, actually in her house? And Josephine, she had been under a spell also. And now that spell was broken. He too felt that he was no longer enchanted. He could stay home now and work on his book again. He could take renewed interest in the opposition party to which he belonged, filled with his private thoughts. He only half listened to his aunt, who was saying, I wish I could dismiss my fears, but I confess that I am still worried. The child does look a frightful mess. Aymar laughed. Newborn babies are hardly ever very beautiful. What is strange about this? One is that it should be able to lift its head on the very first day of its life. I never saw or heard of such a thing, but Françoise says she has seen that before. That's pretty small reason for believing the little fellow is born to be hanged. I haven't really any reason at all to think anything if you want me to put that way, but I have intuitions. And frankly I am uneasy. Well, we'll see, said Aymar, and dismissed the matter. Maybe we shall and maybe we shan't. Perhaps we shall never see him again. Why? Well, he is to be sent to Brittany to Mère Kardec's sister-in-law, and we shall take Josephine back here if she will continue to be good, or else she may go back to her village. That will settle this affair. Aymar found the whole matter of supreme indifference, a fact which surprised him. What? Could he have changed so fast? Madame Didier was busy for the next few days. She bought a good layette for the baby and saw that a proper birth certificate was made out, one which involved neither the church nor herself. Previous to the making of the birth certificate, she paid a visit to the church where Pitaval had been priest. She spoke to the sacristan as if her sole mission in coming there was to arrange for the christening of the child. As a matter of fact, she had another reason. She had never known or else had forgotten what Pitaval's first name was. Still, his child ought properly to bear his name. Casually she said, I hear that Father Ernest Pitaval is now officiating in Nîmes. Her part in his dismissal was unknown. You mean Father Bertrand Pitaval? The sacristan said. Of course, she answered. A few days later the child was dutifully christened. Aymar had to stand godfather and give it the names Bertrand Aymar. Its last name was Caillet, which stood for the mythical husband of Josephine, who was off on a long sea voyage. Back from church, Madame Didier began at once. Now, Josephine, I shall let you have your choice. You may go back to your village or you may stay here. I suppose, said Josephine, that if I went home people would laugh at me for having a baby, wouldn't they? They needn't know that you have had a baby, because we shall send the child to be taken care of in Brittany. Then I would rather stay here, she said, because I want to be with my baby. But you can't keep your baby here either, Madame Didier explained. We can't have it here in the house. Then I shall go back home with the baby. But child, think of what you will be exposed to. And how will you earn a living? What will you say to people when they ask you how you happen to have a baby? Why, madam, I shall tell them the truth, she said naively. This gave Madame Didier pause. The truth was what she didn't want told. What would they think of her at home when they learnt that her servant had had an illegitimate son as a result of being sent out on an errand to a church? And what would they think of the fact that she had done so little to secure Father Pitaval to his responsibility? Whatever happened, she didn't want this matter thrashed out among the gossips of her home village. She sat back and cogitated. For a moment, if she sent the girl packing, God only knew how this business would come flying back to her doorstep again. Wherever she was, this much was certain: Josephine would link her, Madame Didier, with her condition. This was terrible, but then again the link was there after all and not to be denied. Only it was ridiculous, this being responsible for someone else's misdeed. Again, if she put Josephine in an institution of whatever nature, there would be no evading of official papers to be made out, and of such papers Madame Didier had had her hands full these last few days, and she wanted no more of that. She took a sudden decision which, seeing that it was forced upon her, was not far-fetched. Well, for the moment you may stay here, she resigned herself. After all, the gossips of the whole arrondissement knew of the case, in even greater detail than she herself. Moreover, it was only Christian charity that she should continue to take care of an accident in which she could not consider herself quite without guilt. Yes, it was only Christian charity. She clung to that phrase. She repeated it to herself when she happened to meet someone of the neighborhood before whom she would have quailed otherwise, and with the mental repetition of that saving phrase she found the strength to hold up her head and speak out without fear. In truth, she was more than resigned to her duty as a Christian. She could not very well live in the same house with a baby and fail to fall under that strange influence which all babies soon exert upon those who see them. Frequently, this influence, which naturally seizes first upon the mother, climbs out and attaches itself to all those within its range. Like ivy, it has tentacles that hold fast whatever they come into contact with. Little Bertrand was truly a model baby. He never cried. At night he slept, curled up in a most delightful manner. When awake between his long naps, during the day, he responded cheerfully to those who bent over his cradle and talked to him. His whole face would break into a puckered smile. His soft, brown eyes would glisten with amusement. He would open his mouth and a low gurgle of sheer joy would come out of his throat. His health was equal to his spirits. He filled his belly full at his mother's breasts, and when he was weaned he ate whatever was given him and thrived upon. He grew at a fine rate, and teethed without any trouble. No one surely could have wished for a better child. But we are proceeding too fast. When Aymar, who took least interest of all the occupants of the house in the baby's progress, would see his aunt gurgling back at the baby in that silly manner that is incomprehensible to those who do not share it, then he would tease her for her previous fears. One day she said to him abruptly, "I'll talk to you later." That evening when the house had become quiet, when Françoise and Josephine had retired to the room they shared with the baby behind the kitchen, then she spoke to her nephew and relieved herself of her accumulated observations. "I am far from having thrown overboard all my misgivings," she began. "Indeed, I am more than ever certain that Bertrand is an unusual child." "You mean in the fact that he never cries?" "He might be dumb," suggested Aymar. "Children are often born dumb, I am told." "Yes," she admitted. "He may be dumb. We shan't know until a few months from now. As to that, when the time comes for him to begin to talk, personally I think he will turn out normal in that respect." "Then what are you still afraid of? Have you ever noticed his eyes?" "Yes, of course, they are very fine eyes, I should say." "Well, I don't mean his eyes so much as his eyebrows." "What about them?" "They are very full and joined together across the nose." "And what do you deduce from that?" "In our part of the country that was a sign of a low nature." "Another superstition," Aymar said. "It might be simply inheritance." "Now that you remind me of it," said Madame Didier, "Father Pitaval did have the same eyebrows." "Just as I said. Like father, like son." "That's precisely it. I'm afraid he might turn out to be just such an uncontrollable character." "Well, that's still far from now." Aymar laughed at the picture that came suddenly to his mind of little Bertrand attempting rape. "And what else do you see?" "A much more fearful matter this. So rare that I myself have never seen it. Yet, though I have heard old people speak of it as a sign that is the most sure and most terrible of all signs that mark the soul that belongs to the devil." Her voice had sunk so low that Aymar had to lean forward to hear her, especially inasmuch as a cold March storm was rattling at the double windows. Despite himself he was moved, and either her words or a cold draught finding a crack in the window and blowing down his back made his spine shiver. "Well," he urged, "I remember that when I was a little girl my grandmother used to tell me stories of the forests and the monsters that live there. The headless horseman, who strikes those who see him with insanity, the tree where the Swedish hirelings hung 5 men. Their souls are now in that tree, and that is why it will never die until Judgment Day. The white deer who comes one night every year to look for a mate, who must be a pure young girl." "Children shouldn't be told such stories," was Aymar's comment. "Sometimes, so my grandmother used to say, men come to the village fair who have never been seen before and never will be seen again. They are men from the sea and are looking for prey to drag down into their underwater dwellings. They can be recognized by the fact that the hems of their clothes are always slightly moist and their hands are often webbed. Their teeth are sharp and pointed. Sometimes they are wolves from the mountains. Then they can be recognized by the hair that grows on the palms of their hands." In the silence that followed her reminiscences she added, "Bertrand has hair on the palms of his hands." The cold spring with its constant rains and chill had proven too much for Madame Didier, whose health had been undermined by the vexations of the last few years. The death of her husband, the terrible days of 48 when she discovered Aymar wounded in a hospital, and this last event, the treachery of Father Pitaval and the misfortune of Josephine, which she had had to add to her burdens. One day she had been out tending to various purchases. The morning had been so beautiful. There was a touch of spring in the air and the sky was delightfully blue, with that fresh clear blue that comes only after a long hard winter, when all nature seems to have been purged of its vileness. But in a brief hour, while she was in a shop looking over materials, the weather took a sudden turn for the worse. The sky became overcast, a cold wind arose and soon sheets of rain were sweeping diagonally across the streets. The flawless morning had turned into a dismal afternoon. Upon coming out of the store, Madame Didier first noticed how bad the weather really was. She ordered a cab, but none could be found empty. She waited inside, hoping every moment that the rain would abate, but it seemed only to grow fiercer. The stuffy air of the shop, traversed by cold draughts at every opening of the door, soon affected her. She felt hot and cold by turns. Her throat had a soft, painful lump in it. She wanted to get home quickly and have Françoise prepare her a hot tisane while she went to bed. That always fixed her up. She determined at last to brave the weather to the boulevard beyond, where she would either get a cab or take refuge in a café, and there drink something hot. Pulling the collar of her astrakhan coat firmly around her neck, she walked out, head bowed against the driving rain. 2 steps beyond the door and she had slipped and fallen into a puddle of water. In a trice she was soaked through and through. Kind people helped her up and found a fiacre for her so that she was soon home. For days she lingered between life and death. At last her peasant strength, not totally rubbed off by her long existence in the city, came to her rescue, and she grew better. During all of her illness she had yearned wistfully for a sight of the baby, but she had feared that she might infect it in some way and had therefore refused to permit it to be brought into the room. Françoise and Aymar, forbidden now to go near the baby, had to bring her long reports of its doings, reports which they secured from Josephine. The house was divided into 2 camps which communicated from a distance. There came a day when she could feel that her illness was definitely behind her. It was a pleasant and true spring day, not such a treacherous one as had brought on her illness. The windows were flung open and the curtains moved in a gentle breeze. Today, she told Françoise and Aymar, I shall have Bertrand brought in here. It will do you good to see him, said Françoise with tears in her eyes. And shall I too be allowed to see him, now that you are so well? Of course, my good Françoise. Beast that I am, I had forgotten completely that I deprived you of him. Come, kiss me quick and say that you forgive me. Now go run quick and fetch him. At that moment they became aware of a strange noise, a choking, howling, sobbing sound, indescribable in words. Madame Didier and Françoise looked at each other in surprise. Then Françoise dashed out. Aymar asked, what the deuce is that? The noise grew louder, deeper, more resonant and less choked. Josephine came running back with Françoise. Madame, she cried out, it's Bertrand. He must be dreadfully ill. Oh, do send for a doctor quick. The doctor will be here soon, Françoise replied. That must be he at the door now. She ran to admit Dr. Robiet, who had come to pay his daily visit to Madame Didier. I don't approve of dogs in the houses of my patients, were his first words, commenting on the sad howls that filled the apartment. Oui, monsieur, said Françoise, trembling in every limb, and ushered him in to Madame's bedchamber. Ah, well, the patient is looking exceptionally well today, he said, cheerfully, taking Madame's pulse in his hand. You should get up a little now, and exercise a bit, but not too much. I am not the patient today, said Madame Didier seriously, but Madame Caillet's baby, who seems to be suffering terribly. Don't you hear him? The doctor, quite surprised to discover that these dismal sounds came from a baby and not a dog, left at once for the rear chambers with Josephine and returned a short while later. I can find nothing wrong with the little lad. On the contrary, he seems fit in every way. A little fright or hysteria, perhaps. Did anyone scare him? No, Josephine asserted. I know, because I am the only one who has been seeing him since Madame here has been ill. Well, I'll write out a prescription for a soothing dose that will quiet him, and when he wakes up I suspect he will have quite forgotten about his fright. But that noise is absolutely terrifying, Monsieur le Docteur, said Madame Didier. He'll stop just as soon as he gets some of this, the doctor replied. Meanwhile, you had better have the doors shut so that you will not be disturbed. Remember, you must be very careful. You have been seriously ill. Don't forget that. All doors were thereupon shut tight, and only a faint sound managed still to penetrate into Madame Didier's chamber. Soon even that stopped, for Josephine had returned with the necessary concoction, and the baby had fallen into a deep and silent slumber. Madame Didier arose and sat near the window in an easy chair opposite Aymar. She put her thin hand with its pale silky skin traversed by blue veins on his knee and said, "You've been a good son to me, Aymar. It's good to be sitting across from you." He wanted to say, "Nonsense," gruffly as befitted the occasion, but the words were caught in a lump in his throat. After a while he managed to say, "Now, take good care of yourself and don't be off buying silly materials in bad weather anymore." In the evening he sat by her bedside and she recalled to him the pranks he used to play when he came out during summers to their country home. A faint noise growing louder began to disturb him. Evidently the baby had awakened and began to cry again. Good that all the intervening doors were shut. His aunt was apparently unconscious of the renewed howling of the child. Wishing to make sure that her mind should not stray from her mood of reminiscing, he put leading questions to her. "I have a dim recollection of something about a hedgehog. What was that?" "Oh, that was very funny," she began briskly and took his hand in hers. "You had always wanted a hedgehog and we would not let you keep one. Then one summer when we came back, we found the house overrun with cockroaches. That was when we had that lazy caretaker and his drunken wife. Do you remember them?" "Not very well," he said. "Was I 4 years old then?" "Within a month or two of 5, I think." "Oh yes, I recall now distinctly when you had your 5th birthday. It was that very summer. But let me tell you about the hedgehog. You had been bothering your mother for a pet hedgehog. God only knows where you conceived the notion. Anyhow, when we came out to our house and found the place just crawling away with bugs, you claimed that hedgehogs would eat them all up. Of course we didn't believe you, but you were so insistent. But if we hadn't sent it out into the garden again, I think the cockroaches would have eaten it up, for certainly it never touched a single one of them. Yes, I remember too that." His mind was so busy listening to the weird howling of the baby that for a moment he was unaware that his aunt had suddenly ceased talking. Then he wondered quickly. Had she finally heard it too? It was a ghastly sound, more like the baying of a moonstruck dog on a lonely farm than the crying of a human baby. No, she hadn't heard, she was asleep. He had scarcely thought this when a great fear came over him, a fear so mad that he rose in horror from his chair. His hand, which his aunt had been holding, slipped readily out of her grasp. He stood thus for a second, not knowing what to do. Then he ran out. In the hall near the kitchen he came upon Josephine. "I was just going to give him another dose when he stopped all of himself. He's all right now. I don't know what to make of it, monsieur. I only hope he didn't wake Madame from her sleep." "No," he said dully. "Madame is dead."